Welcome to a follow-up discussion that started a month ago already. A month ago, we met to discuss basically the political economy of the pandemic. And in the end, it turned out more a discussion of Latvia's economic history of the past 30 years. We looked at some of the key decisions and key developments that took place in the region in the last 30 years, namely the restoration of independence as well as the financial crisis. And then we finished off the discussion with what has been happening in Latvia as well as globally in the last year or so. So basically since the pandemic. And today we decided to continue the discussion and sort of treat this as a follow-up discussion. And instead of looking toward the past, look more towards the future and discuss some of ideas that have been discussed even more so in the last couple of months since the pandemic, mainly because the pandemic has been such a shock to the economy that it's clear that there's a lot of innovative and a lot of creativity revolving around how to actually structure the economy in the future in order to avoid such unexpected shocks. And we're going to be discussing 4 ideas, and I kind of identified these ideas as the kinds that I thought personally to be interesting, but also sort of judging from what people have been discussing in several kind of circles around the world. I thought these are the ideas that seem to make the most sense in Latvia. And they kind of concern different segments of the economy. They concern the tax policy, they concern the industrial policy, social policy, as well as banking. And today we're basically the same set of participants as we were last month. Just to remind everybody who is here present in the discussion. First, we have Professor Jeffrey Sommers, who's a professor of political economy and public policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We have Kaspars Biškens, who is a development economist and infrastructure development expert with professional experiences in leading Baltic transport companies as well as projects and also experienced Latvian diplomatic service. And finally, we have Andris, who's also an economist, the CEO of Primex. As I noted, we've basically met today to have a chat about four ideas. These are the land tax, the national development policy, national development bank, a job guarantee program, as well as the discussion about an export-led economy and what that really means. The discussion, the structure of the discussion is going to be fairly simple. I'm going to say a couple of words about each of these policy ideas, and then I'm going to open the floor as well. And then we're gonna be able to have a chat, a more in-depth discussion, basically about each of these ideas, what that idea really is, what's sort of the challenge of introducing such an idea in Latvia, and then if these challenges were removed, what would be sort of the desired outcomes of introducing these policies. And the first one that I want to introduce is the land tax. An idea that's fairly old. It's by many described as the ideal tax. Some say that it's basically the only necessary tax in an economy, the one that's most likely to drive economic prosperity. It has the land tax idea has enjoyed a variety of supporters from all kinds of economists: Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Henry George, and even Milton Friedman. But in Latvia, land tax has not really enjoyed the same kind of admiration as elsewhere, and attempts to reform the entire tax system on immovable property, it has met with kind of frustrated resistance, as we saw this summer as well. So perhaps I'll ask Kaspars right away, since I know that you have thought about the tax policy a lot in Latvia. You know the ins and outs of it, and you've had clear ideas on how to develop it. Perhaps you can give us a brief introduction on what is the land tax and why is the land tax considered to be such a good and desirable part of the entire tax system.
Thanks, Andris, and hi everyone, and many thanks for having me in this wonderful company, continuing our discussions the previous time around. And in fact, if I'm allude to the 4 policies that we are discussing today, very important to establish right from the beginning that this is nothing groundbreaking. I mean, from a historical point of view, these policies, even in conjunction, all of these 4 have, of course, extensively been applied all the way back to Hamilton's United States, to Friedrich List's and Bismarck's Germany, to the Asian tigers, the Nordics. All of them, in one way or the other, had a mix of these policies in place in order to climb the ladder of development. And of course, we covered the kind of the historical recourses last time around, so maybe important to focus now on the practical side. But it is also important, you already alluded to some of the economic history of the idea of land value taxation. And indeed, it is seen by many economists as the perfect tax. And if even Milton Friedman, who advocated no taxes at all, would say that this is the least bad tax, alongside kind of the more progressive economists who advocated, like Henry George, that this should in fact be the single tax that's allocated in the economy. But of course, originally, in the late 18th century, with the first industrial revolution starting in Great Britain, of course, these classical liberal economists, they viewed these aristocratic and landlord feudal privileges as a big barrier to the process of economic development, to the distribution of economic prosperity, kind of the unleashing of the wave of entrepreneurship. And from their perspective, and that's why they're called liberal economists, which is often misunderstood and misinterpreted today in a very neoliberal interpretation, is that for them, a free, well-functioning market was not free from regulation, it was free from economic rents. So in order to better understand the essence of the land value tax, we must revisit the concept of economic rent, and especially rent as the unearned wealth and income, derived from different assets and economic activity. John Stuart Mill called it the unearned increment that the landlord earns in his sleep, which is basically the wealth and income that accrues without any kind of effort, entrepreneurship, innovative energy, or the process of innovation or knowledge, basically no active behavior on behalf of the owner. So of course, that kind of surplus value was seen already during the initial years of the first industrial revolution as a preventing factor for development. And there are many examples also in a modern economy where these economic rents accrue. Of course, high value land holdings is one example, especially if used for a speculative hoarding purpose, where of course the appreciation of the land is intrinsically tied, the appreciation of the land value is intrinsically tied to the locational value of that land. So as the society develops, it is nothing much that the landowner needs to do, but basically as society and economy develops, the land value keeps appreciating. And if untaxed, it serves as the additional burden, as one of the three main capital elements in the economy, to reduce the competitiveness in the economy. And hence, of course, the idea that this surplus value, which is often the result of common efforts, not the efforts of the owner, is the natural tax base. And importantly, and just to end this introduction, there are 6 key elements to the land value tax. One, that it is obviously a progressive tax. Of course, the higher the wealth, the higher the land ownership, and of course, therefore, the higher the tax if land is taxed. As for example, very successfully done in Hong Kong and Singapore, where this is basically the basis of those city-state, historical economic models. The second one, and critically important for Latvia, is that the land value tax is unavoidable. I mean, you can't hide land. I mean, you can hide transactions, you can employ people in the gray economy, you can't hide land. As long as that land is properly valued through a comprehensive land value mapping, you always see the tax base and you can allocate the fair tax. And the third element is that the taxation promotes efficient use, because if you hoard the land, if you underinvest in the land, the tax will keep increasing, and basically that will lead to a very high cost of maintaining that speculative asset. The fourth one is that it leads to a more territorially balanced development. In other words, in places where the land is very expensive, it will be more expensive to have property, and also, for example, manufacturing. So that would lead to the spreading out of economic activity. Number 5, again, I already mentioned, it stifles speculation and hoarding. And last but not least, in the economists' terminology, it leads to no deadweight loss. Every other tax leads to deadweight losses, especially taxes on labor, taxes on productive consumption, taxes on industrial profits. Land value tax doesn't have a deadweight loss. So there is no loss of consumer and producer surplus when this tax is used.
Great. That's incredibly comprehensive. I'll tie Jeff in straight away, because the one thing that you mentioned, Kaspars, and I think that's really part of the really the attraction of the tax, especially in the kind of discussions that we have in Latvia, is the fact that you can't sort of hide it, right? You can't hide land, and in that kind of environment where we're so incredibly sort of anxious about paying tax, that's obviously a good requirement. But I think again, as you say, right, that in order to make the tax sort of work, the land has to be properly valued. And I think, Jeff, if you could explain perhaps what does that really mean? And mainly, I guess also the way, how do you really structure the land tax? Is it supposed to, how do you determine what the tax is going to be? Do you take a certain kind of percentage from the entire value of the land, or do you designate a specific lump sum and then reevaluate it on an annual basis? How does the kind of technicalities of a land tax work?
Sure. Well, where I live in the United States, the land tax is quite central to the ability of local governments to adequately fund schools and many other social provisions, and for many of the reasons that Kaspars has just stated. So it's really, really quite important. And it has a number of benefits, and then I'll get into some of the technicalities that you've asked about. And if I don't, Andris, please remind me to return to those. But just as Kaspars says, and I think it's just really worth repeating, and as you've said as well, Andris, I mean, this is the one tax that can be avoided. So again, you cannot hide land. You can maybe hide the owner, but ultimately somebody is going to have to pay for that land. So it's really an ideal tax. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we're trying to push, grandma or the tante or the babushka off her land by imposing a tax on it. Instead, what we're trying to do is to ensure that we can bring other taxes down, income taxes, for instance, actually down, and also having enough revenue to pay for the needs of society, many of which, of course, are essential for promoting economic development, both social and physical infrastructure. So, I know it's a topic that people here are really quite frightened about because one of the few assets that they do have is land. But we do have to remember that at this country's second independence in 1991, a few people did disproportionately grab a lot of land. And then, of course, we had the banks that came in, and through massive lending, they really jacked up the value of land. And so what that has meant is that now we have a lot of people who have been priced out of housing, or they're just paying far too much for it. One of the ways that we can also bring the price of housing down is by taxing the land. Because people only have so much income, and if some of it has to go for taxation, there's not going to be as much left over to paying larger mortgages to Swedish banks in the form of credits that they need to get that land. So it's a net gain in so many ways. I mean, again, taking some of that money that otherwise would go toward debt service payments to foreign banks, for which Latvia gets nothing, and instead keeping some of that income at home, investing it here in your own local and national needs. Just very, 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 very important. So it can both be used to correct really what's frankly been a past injustice in terms of tax evasion, avoidance, and this kind of neo-feudalism that has been reestablished through just a few people grabbing a lot of land. And I don't blame anyone for, playing the game as it's structured. That's, what we all do. But we can correct some of these past bad policies and create a new set of policies which create far more positive development. Now, getting back to how you do it. Well, it's not all that complicated. You essentially just need what are good land value maps. So what we do in the United States is we have tax assessors, and they have these cadastral maps that they develop of cities, and they more or less figure out what every parcel of land is worth. And that is how the land gets taxed. And if a mistake is made, you have the ability to rejoin that assessment and to lodge a complaint with your local tax assessor and work out what is the proper value of the land. But they're generally very, very good, the assessors, at what they do. So it's quite uncommon for anyone to have to do that. But if a mistake is made, there are very easy means by which these can be corrected. So the land value tax is both easy to collect. It's very fair in terms of people paying fair value for their land. You can not only have the inherent or intrinsic progressive structure of it through the increasing taxes that you pay as the land becomes more valuable, but you can also have, of course, progressive rates of land value taxes, as you do in say, Riga. So you can ensure that people who don't have a lot of income on relatively modest properties don't pay that much. But for those who have acquired a lot of property and the value of that property is quite high, both because of its quantity and its location, you can get more taxes from it. And again, that in turn funds your social needs and your infrastructure. So it's really quite an excellent means by which, again, we can redress some of these past policy mistakes that have been made with the inequalities that they've created and their impediments to development through preventing sufficient funds being available for some of the needs that we have, while also creating a more fair system going forward. Andris, did I answer your question regarding how we structure the land?
Absolutely. And if I just understand correctly, you would mainly the way you structure it is mainly as a kind of rate, right? So you would say it's a certain kind of percentage from the value of the land that you tax, essentially.
Right. Yeah. And it, again, I mean, you have a lot of freedom here because you can do whatever you want here. I mean, you can have the tax be developed at a national level if you chose to go that route, or you can do it locally. So there are any number of ways to cut this up and figure out what's the best way to ensure that you get the revenues from it and to meet the various needs that you have. And the discussion, of course, is really quite important given the lockdown that we're seeing in Latvia right now. And as we know, over the past couple of decades, you've been spending about 5 or 6% of your GDP on health, which is, a little bit below, quite a bit below the roughly 9% averages that we see for the OECD averages spent for health, not to mention the rather ridiculous roughly 20% of GDP that we now spend in the United States. So this could be a way to rebuild some of the public health capacity that you kind of shed under neoliberalism when everyone was thinking about having a kind of hyper efficient economy, and one which shed all of its surplus capacities. And sometimes during a crisis, you need additional capacities. And so I think this, again, is one of the great ways that perhaps you can identify some of those revenues that can rebuild some of those capacities that you've lost to address just the kind of problem that you're having right now with the need for more hospital beds and the ability to deal with a public health emergency such as you have emerging at the moment.
Yanni, you're an entrepreneur, and from a business perspective, one might say that if we want to make land taxes sort of the value, sort of the basis of our tax system in Latvia, that would probably mean increasing the land value, the tax on land, And from a business perspective, that might be seen as something that's not very desirable, since that might increase the cost of doing business. Prices might go up for the customers, etc. Is that a reasonable objection to the idea of land tax, or would that be actually beneficial to businesses?
I think that regarding the tax policy, I think we all have to agree that a certain amount of tax is necessary. And then because we need tax to fund schools, we need tax to fund the hospitals, we need tax to fund the roads. And then the question, once you decide that the tax is necessary, is where do you place that tax? And you have essentially two places where you can place that tax. You can place that tax on the labor. So everybody that works has very high taxes that pays on the salary every day from working. Or you can place it, for instance, on the land. And I think these are kind of the choices. And if we are like adult and grown up about the situation, and we understand that we have to place them either here or there, then we understand that if we place very low land tax, like what it is today, this means we place more tax on labor. So whenever you receive your paycheck, sadly, more goes away. So there's no money that you can spend. This money goes away from you and you lose. So in that sense, land tax actually gives more cash to everybody that works. And I think that if you look at it this way, then very clearly you would prefer to have land tax and rather have a larger amount of the take-home pay back in your pocket, so you know how you can spend it rather than give it away to the government. I think that in Latvia, though, the people are against the land tax for two reasons. One is that everybody is afraid, the land tax will go up, but my labor tax will not change at all, so it's simply more taxation, so let's not do it, because why have more taxation? And the second is, for a lot of people, the land is the only asset, so or flat or the house that they built is the only asset. So they have worked very hard, they paid like a third of their income on the house, and maybe they've paid it out, and now you want to take it away? That seems like unfair. And so people are against it. They rather want to have that value in themselves. A lot of people have this idea of passive income. That's very modern way how to express, to be like a little bit of an aristocracy of the old days, because aristocracy in the old days, they had passive income. They had like this huge manor, and there's some peasants working around, and then they had passive income, and then they were very happy. So many people would like to be like a mini aristocracy and have a passive income, maybe not like a nice manor house, but maybe like three flats, 3 apartments, rentals somewhere in Riga, and then passive income, and then they don't have to work, which is like a mini aristocratic way how to live. And then they are also against the land tax because they're afraid that that is not good for them. But on the other hand, what do we want as society? I think as a society, we want all productive people actually to work. So, and then the final, I think, group of people that are really against it, not the final, but another group that is against it are the old people, because they are afraid that when their pensions are so low and they are living in a certain place, let's say a house that they earned very hard during the years to acquire, and now you place a high land tax, they have no way to pay. Everybody knows what are the pensions today. I mean, the pensioners, they are barely scraping by, many of them. So how are they supposed to pay now a land tax? That basically means eviction from the house. And so they are totally against that, because why? I mean, they worked all their life to go for it. And for some even, this is like, they simply built a house somewhere in Riga. Like, I don't know, my grandparents, simply built a house with their own hands. And now you kind of want to take it away from them. It's they don't want to have that. And so I think that to answer the land tax and to have land tax as a kind of a reasonable way forward, I think one of the things that really needs to be answered is, what do we do about the old people that just happen to be living in places with high land tax? So how do we approach this situation? And the other question that we have is, where do we place the land tax? Do we place the land tax on buildings or on the land? Do we place equal land tax on unused and used buildings? That is another question that we have. And so my thoughts about it is that kind of at least harmful way would be, first of all, to find a way around what do we do with the old people. I think for the old people, there are the two choices. Like, one choice is we have a land tax, and then, my grandchild has a lower paycheck, so he has more money in his account and he doesn't fly away to Ireland or somewhere to work because he has enough salary now in Latvia. Also, Latvia becomes richer country, so my grandchild stays in Latvia. That's good for me, because I think grandparents hate when the grandchildren are away somewhere else, so they want actually the country develops. On the one side. On the other side, they don't want to lose the house. So how to square this? I think that if the land tax is introduced, it totally has to have a system that if you don't want to pay land tax, you don't pay. But instead it accumulates in a special account against your property's value. And if it reaches 100% of value, anyway, you are not evicted from that place. You can continue to live there forever. Simply, maybe the value is gone. But for most people, for any reasonable land tax rates, simply you would eat away some portion of the land tax. So let's say maybe your inheritance is going to be smaller, but at least your grandchildren are going to be in Latvia, working here, and that is better anyway. So I think that a kind of a system like that is necessary. I think it doesn't reduce government income by nothing, because all of these non-paid taxes, they can be very easily made into a bond, and that is tradable, because it will be a bond essentially against the value of a real estate, and those are very high highly valued bonds, and the government can have the money anyway, and the people don't have to pay the money. And so if you structure it when a kind of a special government vehicle, it doesn't even influence the total debt levels of the country. So I think it's a kind of a good way how to go about it. Then and that would kind of alleviate the fears and the problems of the old people that can be evicted. Now there's no problem. They can simply stay at their house and be very safe. The second the question is which values to place where, and how large values to place where. I like running, and when I run across Riga, I like to explore places, and I can tell you there are so many places within central Riga that are undeveloped, and you run, and there's beautiful house, nothing, and then just abandoned buildings and things like this, and it's crazy. And it's crazy because we are building, housing developments under the runway in Mārupe, and then driving like 20 minutes to Riga, when we have riverfront properties 5 minutes from us downtown that are completely unused. And why they are unused? These are much better places, I would argue, without a question, than some property in faraway Mārupe, but they are not used because somebody's hoarding them. Somebody got this property, maybe in the 90s through some privatization scheme, and now they're sitting on it and just waiting, until they can sell it. That brings no value, to anybody. That brings no value to people who are forced to build out in Mārupe. Mārupe is not a bad area, and I'm picking up on Mārupe, but let's say, somewhere like far away. And also when we could have had it here. And also infrastructure, everything is here. We would not have to build new schools. People are leaving central Riga right now and going somewhere else. So we have built infrastructure for central Riga, cafes, water supply, schools, sanitation, sewage, everything, and people leave. And now we are building infrastructure somewhere else from zero. It's like a huge waste. And why do we do that? Because people sit on property and just wait until the land value rises. So I think that a very easy way and a very reasonable, credible way would be simply to rise the value, first of all, on the land that is unused, but sits at a kind of a high value somewhere. And I think that maybe that could be the first step how we go about the land value tax. That, all these unused beautiful buildings that we have in central Riga, they should be simply taxed. These guys should either develop the building or sell it. There is zero value for economy, for society, for everybody to have it. And even it's zero value for people around these houses, because their property value is lower because there are unused or bad looking buildings around them. So nobody wins. So just to kind of sum up what I was saying, so I think that land tax is a great tax. The issue is many people view this as their only asset, and then they are afraid that the value of the asset will be gone, and they would like to have some passive income, so which are all very nice things to do. But the people don't understand that that they will be either taxed on the wages or on the land, and so there's no way around it. So rather, I think it's easier to be taxed on the land. And I think that for old people, we need to develop a special scheme. And we need, first of all, to tax the land that is unused, that sits at a high value and unused. Like the port area, which is like a super prime example. The huge areas, hectares and hectares in port area, which are unused. Why? And it's like, makes zero sense to me. I mean, we should tax it. We should push the developments to happen there, rather than in some faraway places. I think it would be good for everybody.
Great, Jeff or Kaspers, perhaps you have something to add to these 2 points made by Janis.
Yeah, just if I can intervene quickly, and then Kaspers can. So I just, of course, completely agree with Janis, and of course, we've all had these discussions with each other before. What is happening in the city center of Riga is just absolutely a scandal in terms of all of this empty housing. And the reduction of housing density. And for the Progressivi party, which is very green in its orientation, this is also a very important green issue. Housing and population density are much greener, and it actually brings costs down for everyone as a similar amount of infrastructure is serving more people. So it's very important to do this. And just as Janis says, and again, I don't blame anyone who actually acquired lots of property when it was there to be acquired, but they should not be allowed to just hold it because that imposes costs on others. Again, in terms of maintaining more infrastructure with less people living on it. And again, the land value tax, and one could even add potentially some other taxes to encourage the development of empty buildings. And it would make the city center more vibrant with more people living here. And you don't want to repeat the same kind of suburbanization mistakes that the United States made in terms of, replicating all this infrastructure and then creating a lot more pollution as people are commuting out to wherever they're going to. It just doesn't make any economic sense. And lastly, regarding this passive income issue, which Janis references, yeah, I mean, I completely get that. I have an extra home with 2 rentable units in it, and I'm a recipient of some passive income. I guess it's okay for me, but you really want as less of this as possible. You're making other people pay for you. Essentially. And, this is the difference between rich countries and poor countries. In rich countries, like Germany, you have a lower percentage of total income going towards housing. And it's in backward poor countries that typically you have these situations where, a few people, they grab all the land and they generate all these economic distortions. And they impose all these costs on everyone else. So you really want to put in place policies that disincentivize this as much as you can. And then in the end, as Janis was suggesting, the majority of people will see their quality of life improve. The grandchildren will be here. They won't have to leave, as Janis was saying, to Ireland or the UK, and you'll have more people here paying taxes. That means your taxes, if you're here, go down with more people paying taxes. and everyone has a higher quality of life. And just as Giannis was saying, this trope that somehow you're going to be throwing the elderly out on the streets with a land value tax. It's a perfectly understandable fear, but there are so many ways around this, just as Giannis was suggesting. And the first time that I began talking about these ideas here with my colleague Michael Hudson in 2006, we tried to explain that you can just collect these taxes in arrears if you need to later. And let's be honest, I mean, most pensioners are not living in manors or in 160 square meter apartments in Alberta. And even if they are, you can find ways of making sure that they don't have to pay their taxes now. But most are living very modestly. And we can definitely ensure that they are completely protected and in no way are at risk of losing their housing. The big risk is that in the future, if you don't undertake these measures now, what you have is a country with hollowed out cities. The people leave. You lose your tax base that incentivizes even more immigration, less people having children, and your standard of living declines over the long run instead of improving. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's right. And there's one more group of people that are really against the rise of the land tax. That's the people that have the super expensive houses. In Kipsala, for instance, there is a Gipsfabrika, and in Gipsfabrika there are some apartments that are the most expensive apartments in the city. I saw them listed on the real estate portals for €2 million. So there's like a 3-story apartment with beautiful view of Daugava. And then there are some places where you see that there are these white flags out, denoting that people are kind of against the land tax. And I saw there's this white flag out on this €2 million apartment. So this guy's like, oh, don't raise my land tax, I can't pay it, I will be beggared. Come on, it's like, have a heart, man. You have a €2 million apartment and you can't pay land tax? Like, really? That's ridiculous. Some people are simply ridiculous. And then you have a lot of them, coming in the press and crying that the land tax, it's beggaring them, in his €2 million apartment that he will not be able to afford. That's like, it's ridiculous, simply.
Just to build on 3 of the points that were discussed, I mean, stellar introductions by Giannis and Jeff. One is with regard to the distinction that Giannis already emphasized between the real kind of in the real estate tax between the buildings and the land. I fully agree that the focus should be on the land because, buildings tax or improvements tax inevitably leads to a lower level of maybe construction and development. I do agree that, in the higher value segments, let's say manor houses and expensive properties, let's say in excess of €300,000 values, should have a progressive rate. But there should also at the same time be some kind of an untaxed minimum, maybe €50,000 or something for the buildings. The land, of course, is a different story. And again, building on Giannis Riverside example, some time ago, I was discussing this idea with regard to how to improve the use of land in the Freeport of Riga. Giannis actually mentioned that ports are also very good examples where maybe you don't have ownerships because usually the land is owned by the port, but you have these long-term leases. And of course, back in the day, they were signed based on political connections. There's a lot of rentier activity there, people hoarding, sitting on these very highly valuable land plots. And there's a relatively easy way how that can be taxed away and a more efficient distribution of that land to be promoted. So for example, today you have 1.5% of cadastral value annual land tax rate on the land. And then also that's a flat rate. And the only exception is that you have additional 1.5 for unused or idling agricultural land. So it's pretty primitive, but at least the Institute of Land Tax is there in Latvia. Many countries don't have it. So let's say you have 3 types of terminals in the Freeport of Riga. Well, you have a nice, environmentally sustainable container terminal operating at full capacity, so really using the best of that land. So that terminal could perhaps, we could think in terms of a coefficient system. It's flat tax rate and coefficients. So such a terminal would get a 0% coefficient. So it won't be paying land tax because it's already using that land to the best possible value. if it's the port territory. Then you have a second category, a well-functioning oil and coal terminal. Well, they're using the land, but they're creating a lot of negative externalities in terms of pollution, well, especially for coal and oil product. Let's assume that terminal would then have a 200% coefficient. So it will have to pay the land tax at a double rate to compensate for the negative externalities. And then let's take the third type of real estate use or land use, which is what Andris is referring, all of those meadows in the Riga Freeport territory. Those should, for example, be subject to an 800% coefficient. So they would have to pay 8 times the going land value rate annually, which will definitely either encourage them to invest and go to the 200 or the 0% coefficient range, or they will have to basically relinquish those contracts. And that's the kind of rate plus coefficient policy that can be applied not just in ports, but in industrial territories all along. And then the final point on municipalities and residential properties. Today we have this weird situation where municipalities, they collect real estate tax. 100% of what they collect stays with the municipality. And at the same time, they collect 80%, and the new legislation will make it 75, but still 3/4 of the personal income tax. And because, of course, labor taxation is much higher, this creates kind of like an adverse selection or a bit of a moral hazard, where municipalities, they usually give people up to 90%, or even in some municipalities up to 100% real estate tax discounts, in order to encourage people to declare themselves in that particular municipality in order to get their personal income tax streams, because those are much more valuable as a source of municipal income for their budgets. So that needs to change. I mean, municipalities should be prevented from giving these major discounts and basically reducing the role of real estate values, because in some areas, including a near wider Rigan municipality where I live, you can obviously see that because of these discounts, people are actually encouraged to hoard properties, not to develop them, because they're basically getting a discount on the real estate tax. And some of them, they don't have salaries, especially those who receive passive income streams. And it leads to constant underdevelopment, and it leads precisely to what Andris is saying, that the society is unfortunately has to gather its tax revenue from labor and productive consumption.
Great. It seems like we could go on about land tax, but there's a couple of more ideas that I wanted to discuss, and perhaps we can discuss two of them basically at the same time. The one of them is the National Development Bank, and perhaps we can already tie the idea of having a National Development Bank with an idea of an export-led growth and economy. Now, the National Development Banks. That's an idea that, again, it's fairly old. It's something that's used a lot in other countries, but currently at Latvia and basically in the Eurozone generally, banking has largely been privatized, and the prerogative to issue currency has been basically delegated to private institutions. And as I said, sort of the Eurozone is kind of a quintessential example of that, where sort of banking, finance, and money is basically in private hands, and it's almost impossible for us to imagine that these basically banking and money could be subject to public sector controls and directives. But again, in places like China that have experienced very rapid development and industrialization, this has been precisely the case. And I think if we look at the kind of economic environment where we live, it's likely that central banking will probably remain sort of independent in the near future, and will again mainly sort of cater to private interests. But a way forward could be the setup of national development banks. That is something that I think is fairly feasible within the existing political economic climate. So what are they? What are exactly national development banks? Why is such a public bank better for a country's development than sort of the existing structure of having private commercial banks? What are the benefits of having a development bank as opposed to the current system that we have? I'm not sure if anyone wants to sort of jump right in and start explaining it again from the kind of basic level of the idea. Kasper is Jeff.
I think Kaspar should go first on this. He's been thinking a lot about this in the context of Latvia. I think we should lead off with him.
All right. Well, without too much recourse into history, again, we covered that in the previous seminar. There are great examples from KfW in Germany, which is now also in COVID times playing a very, very important role also as a provider of liquidity to companies. Also, Bendes is a great example in Brazil, Korea Development Bank, all of these excellent examples which served and still serve not only as, in a kind of neoliberal theory, there is also a role for a development institution, but that is usually minimized to the role of simply fixing market failures, the so-called market failures. Whereas, of course, the historic successful examples and some of the more progressive economic theory of today, including that by Marianna Mazzucato and her team, shows that there is a room for a mission-oriented, active development bank. And in Latvia, we have precisely that context. I mean, back in the day, we used to have a land development bank. Now we have Altum, which is not a full-fledged bank. It doesn't have a banking license, although, of course, it has a capacity of providing loans and guarantees and maybe kind of promotes financial inclusion where maybe the traditional banking sector falls short. But overall, there are a number of basic functions that a full-fledged national development bank could promote. I mean, including things related to counter-cyclical finance. We know that whenever times are bad, commercial banks become risk-averse. They are already quite risk-averse when there's a recession, and as we saw also during the 2007-2010 crisis, they're extremely risk-averse. So that dries up liquidity in the market. And the other one is, of course, investment banks or national development banks that promote innovation and structural transformation. Again, we see how KfW in Germany has championed this green transformation of the German economy, of the German energy system. They were among the first ones to invest in solar energy, and we now, of course, see as Germany is diversifying its energy mix, away from coal, away from oil, into renewables, and KfW as the development bank is right in the forefront of that development. Infrastructure development is obviously a great example. I mean, in Scandinavia, much of the infrastructure is financed through national development institutions. And then this leads us to the context for Latvia. I mean, I would say that there, again, I subscribe to the approach that if it's worthwhile having a national development bank, then it is such a bank that has some mission to pursue. And there is a wide range of missions that the Latvian economy could pursue. And some of them are, for example, some economists don't believe in picking winners. I don't think that it has to go down to belief. I think it has to go down to empirical evidence. We see that some of the most successful historically industrial policies and their execution has been based on actually picking winners or national champions. And I'm not saying that we should have a list of 100 companies which now receive all kind of state support, but picking out specialized activities which have comparative advantage, that are long-term scalable, that add to the complexity of the economy, that have a so-called increasing returns potential, that are technologically intense, and of course that can be export-oriented. And there are quite a few industries like that in Latvia. And the other major mission is anything to do with digitalization. Industry 4.0, digitalization of public services. Clearly, the fourth industrial revolution is all about digitalization, including digitalization of infrastructure. Green transformation, that was already mentioned, but clearly also in Latvia, there's a major potential from things like, again, diversifying the energy mix with the elements of import substitution away from fossil fuels, all the way to energy efficiency, which is a long delayed mission that would add a lot of value to the Latvian economy. Then there is the age-old mission of agricultural and forestry cooperation. I mean, we live next door to the world's most competitive agricultural and forestry cooperatives in the Nordics. There's nothing that prevents us from emulating those. And then three final missions for consideration. One is kind of the broader subject of reindustrialization and generally setting up an industrial base which then serves also as basis for an export-driven development. Then I already touched infrastructure, but it is important that there's a national development bank that promotes infrastructure development in what we call a dig once philosophy. In other words, when you build a railway, you make sure you co-synchronize also development of other types of infrastructure, road infrastructure, 5G and fiber infrastructure, energy, water, and all of these other things at the same time. So you derive a lot of benefit from one investment. And then final point, again, as a mission, is the provision of public housing. I'm very happy to hear that in some of the recovery and resilience package measures, public housing has been mentioned as a potential policy. That could be a potential mission of a national development bank. So I think I threw a lot of chips on the table, and we'll be happy to hear what others think about these.
Great. I'm very happy for you, Yanni or Jeff, to react to what Kasper said. There's I guess just two aspects that I think are also worth addressing in one way or another. One is the question of where would, if we did create a national development bank here in Latvia, or transform Altum into a proper bank, what would be the kind of funding requirements, or of where would the bank get the capital from within the what are the kind of rules, the existing rules within the Eurozone, within the European Union that permit funding? What's the kind of requirement side? It might be a technical question, but I guess it's also important to address. Would that bank be able to create capital on its own, or would it still have to go and look for it somewhere else? And the second part, which I also think is sometimes people worry about, the fact that if we did create a public institution like that, there was always the kind of threat of corruption that again the insiders would get their own projects funded, and how would we actually deal with this issue? I'm not sure, Jeff or Janis, if again, I'm happy for you to react to what Kasper said, but just these additional 2 points.
Yeah, I have a slightly different angle on this, so I think Janis should go before me, because it's probably going to be dealing more in sync with Kaspar's remarks. So Janis, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. I think that the question, first of all, of the corruption is a very important question, and we don't want corruption. We also don't want an institution here that creates credit, that creates like a local bubbles here in real estate, or that displaces local banks, commercial banks that want to do their business, and suddenly somebody comes in with a super cheap loans, with state guarantees, and then just displaces them. So those things are bad. So that's something that we don't want. So how to resolve this? I think very clearly it is resolvable if we would tell that development bank that what we want to do is we want to develop export-led economy. If that development bank would support exporting companies only, then in that case, first of all, the corruption risk is minimized. Whenever you are dealing in export, then you don't want to have a bad reputation, and also you are forced to essentially produce a product that is required, that is needed somewhere else outside of Latvia, and you can't corrupt other people to buy it for the most part, and so it is that export kind of angle serves as a clear differentiator that first of all allows to differentiate and select the companies that are producing something useful, that are not corrupt companies, and that are not distorting the local market in any way. What we need in Latvia is we need to bring more money from abroad inside here as revenue from the exports that makes the whole country richer. So again, if we would support those companies, that kind of corruption, that market distortion, all of these things are really going away. So I feel very strongly that we need to build an export-led economy, and I understand that we are going to talk about it in the last segment, so I'm stopping here. But I think that if we would tell the development bank to concentrate on that, that would be simply fabulous. The other things, of course, obviously, that the export bank can concentrate on that as local, maybe would be to tackle some infrastructure challenges that the commercial banks are not interested or willing, that are maybe too far fetched or too risky things to do. I think right now we have Altums. In my opinion, Altums is working very well as an institution. It's not a bank. It would benefit from being a bank, but as it is developing and working quite well. I'm not so sure, I mean, kind of from policy point of view, how easy it would be to transform Altums into a bank, and if the commercial banks would not be too jealous about that. I don't know, but we definitely need to strengthen Altums as a way how to attract funding. And it is clear that today the exporting companies in Latvia are way too small. We need at least triple their size, and they are unable to develop because their capital is too small overall. They have too low capital base. The commercial banks are unable to lend them because they are too weak, our exporters. And if we want to get from here to there, to like a significantly larger exporting sector, we need to have a state support system, a state support financial system, because without that, without money that is available for development, we will simply continue this very slow growth. Is growth, yes, I'm not saying it's not growth, there are some very good examples, but very, very slow. We're growing very, very slowly. If we really want to get rich, if we want to grow at something like 7% per year, which would be a nice and sustainable way how to grow, we need far more capital into the economy, and without a government intervention in the export sector, that capital is not forthcoming. It's an illusion to think it will not come. So we need to do something about it. So strengthening Altums, perhaps converting into a national development bank, perhaps setting up a national development bank, these things need to be really discussed out, but it's a very important subject. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the suggestions tendered by both Kaspars and Janis in the score. And, just to remind people that these are historically proven, tried and successful means by which development has been fostered. By extending credit at lower prices to key sectors of the economy, you can advance their development and thereby making the rest of the economy grow faster as well. I would also add that development tends to, over time, actually reduce corruption as well. So we should remember that. So slow growing economies and economies in which many rents essentially are being extracted from it tends to increase corruption. So this is a means by which over the long term you can actually reduce corruption, although of course you need very good oversight to make sure that some of the abuses that Andris and Janis have both alluded to do not happen in any great measure. And I think some of Janis's suggestions in terms of where you target the money are certainly good ones. Regarding what you said, Andris, if we take a look at Article 123 of the Lisbon Treaty, it's actually kind of vague, which is good. I mean, it says that you can't buy bonds directly from the central bank, but you can do other things to create credit. I mean, you can just create credit on your national development bank's balance sheet, extend it out as loans, and then the money comes back in terms of debt service payments. I mean, so, and there are various quantitative easing strategies as well, which can be produced. So there's end runs around some of the restrictions that are put in place, unfortunately, by Article 123, which I think has served the European Union very badly. So there's just a lot of, let's just say, bending of the rules that have occurred with Article 123, and I'm highly encouraging of that process. Because again, it has been something that has been bad for development. So by all means, look at who has successfully bent those rules, follow their lead. I said I wanted to go in a different direction, and I'll explain what I meant by that earlier. I think that, we should give more consideration to nonprofit institutions, not necessarily public, but nonprofit institutions at the consumer level of banking as well. Kaspars mentioned the role of producer cooperatives in the Nordic countries, and they are very impressive in terms of what they've achieved. And in fact, many of those same kinds of institutions were exported by the Nordics to the United States in the 19th century in areas that were resource rich in terms of forestry, et cetera, and agriculture, produced very, very good results. But it seems as though the Latvian consumer is overburdened with fees from its banking system. And both, whether we look at Germany or even the United States, where we have very robust levels of credit unions in place and development of credit unions, I think it might behoove Latvia to consider developing more of these kinds of institutions where you have postal banks, as Japan does. Put credit unions in your post offices, in your libraries, and give people access to the money so they're not charged so much money for just accessing it as they are through many of your private banks. And this would be another way of getting money in people's pockets, and then they would be spending that in the larger economy and generating economic activity. So I think that's something to give consideration to as well.
I fully agree with Jeff, and you can see that, for instance, in Lithuania, they developed a very kind of a krājēsdava sabiedrība, credit union friendly legislation, and they have created via that a very large movement of these krājēsdava sabiedrība credit unions. And now in the Lithuanian countryside, in small villages, in towns, there are a lot of places where you can actually very successfully get the banking services from these credit unions, and you get a lot of credit also from them. And that serves very well the very small micro companies that need to develop right now. So we have right now a huge debate, for instance, in Latvia, what should be the taxation level on the very small companies. And many of the small owners of the small companies say, well, we need this lower taxation because we don't have enough income. And why don't you have enough income? Well, because they don't have any funds to develop. They can't grow bigger so that they would have more productivity and so that they would kind of earn more money and then they can afford more tax. That road is closed. So there's no credit available to them. So they are stuck in a very unproductive small areas, and then obviously they can't pay more tax. And then we are burdened with these guys that are unable then later to receive pensions, to receive social support in case they are ill or something. So it's a kind of a dead-end situation, and we really need to resolve it. Lithuania has been very successful resolving that, and in Latvia, sadly, the legislation that is upheld by the Ministry of Finance and also Latvia's Banka and FKTK, it's completely anti these small cooperative banks. And as a result, Latvian krājēsdava sabiedrības is 10 times smaller than in Lithuania. And as a result, in Lithuania, there's no huge amount of credit that has been flowing to the small communities, to small businesses, to people that want to develop something small locally, out of which they can maybe grow something bigger. And this is a big part of the success story of Lithuania. So we need big development bank to fund bigger things. We need capital fund to fund with capital larger enterprises that want to go big and do something. But we also need, on the small level, on the micro level, on a level of small companies, we need a way how to sustainably finance that. And krājēsdava sabiedrības, these credit unions, definitely is the best way how to do that. It is unimaginable that a big central bank like Swedbank would fund, 2,000 euro loan somewhere in Varakļāne. I mean, it costs more for them to understand that the gentleman or lady from Varakļāne that wants to take out this loan, is he real, is he fake, will he return, will he not? I mean, the cost of doing that for somebody from the very beautiful skyscraper office is prohibitively high. So they will never do that. So you never get this credit. It's not flowing. And then, well, what to do? This lady or gentleman from Varakļāne or Līvāne or somewhere, he'll be just forced to move to Riga. It's bad, it's not good. He has a house there, he has infrastructure there, he has school there. Why do that? So we need to do that for development, more like equal development within country. We really also need to do that. And Lithuania has beautiful system. I fully don't understand why the Ministry of Finance is lazy to take a look at what is done in Lithuania and to copy that, and is hiding behind like empty words that it's kind of risky or that it's unimaginable or that nobody needs it, or other kinds of bureaucratic and empty words that I've heard from them, which is completely ridiculous and completely against them.
Andris, if I may return to one of your two questions with regard to the capitalization of Altum. In full agreement with what both Janis and Jeff are saying about kind of the micro liquidity, which is critical. One is, of course, that today, of course, Altum, whatever they borrow, they can lend, and then they distribute some of the grant funding, but they can't multiply money for sure because they don't have a banking license. So a banking license would go a long way, within the capital adequacy framework of being able to also create money. Ideally, not at loggerheads with the commercial banking sector, but I think there's room for both a national public development bank and the commercial banking sector. But the other, of course, critical cash stream, so to speak, is of course the EU structural funds. And today, unfortunately, they're often distributed on kind of a feudal principles. Yes, you have the finance ministry who's kind of orchestrating the parade, but still it's up to the ministries, up to the civil servants to determine oftentimes, what are the priorities. So that never works in a concerted effort promoting some longer term missions, which is something I think we emphasized during the previous talk. And because of that, this idea of a national development bank for me also goes hand in hand with a proper national industrial and innovation policy, one that promotes the transformation of the Latvian economic structure to, the one that's more modern, sustainable, also diversified and more complex, more socially responsible, and ultimately also digitally ready. And all of these factors would then, of course, serve as competition and competitiveness factors also in export competitiveness.
It seems to make sense to me to actually perhaps move the next couple of segments around and actually address then the issue of how to create an economy that is export led and how does that sort of fit within the wider industrial policy. There's again, the way we spoke about it last time as well. I mean, we've spoken about export for the past 30 years. There's been, at least rhetorically, a certain kind of support for the idea. At the same time, we haven't really become an export country. And again, based on what's been happening since the pandemic, what are the ways in which we should think about these issues? What are exactly the kinds of goods or services that we should be exporting, and then where? And then again, in what way would the National Development Bank come into this picture? Janis, perhaps I'll let you start on this.
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the choices when you are thinking about development of economy is what do you want to develop? Do you want to develop a domestic sector, or do you want to develop an export sector? So I think it is for me, it's very clear that for a very small country like what Latvia is, it's a very small country, the market is very small, and it is impossible to create a company that would have products that are competitive in the pricing if the company is only devoted to the Latvian market. It's too small. So each batch of production is too small, so the self-cost of the product is too high, and it's not competitive. So the only companies that can produce something that is competitive are export-oriented companies, because there the market, compared to very small Latvia, the world is very big. So you can produce in large batches, you can produce something big, so your self-cost goes down, and you become competitive and profitable. So from that perspective, export is the only way how you can develop something like a competitive company. The other thing is is the question, where is the money coming from? I mean, the obvious answer is from the bank, from the ATM machines. So you stick in your credit card and out comes the money. But where does money come there? Where does money come into the economy in the first place? Maybe is the next question. And I think it's coming in from the export. So you sell something abroad, euro comes in, and then that enlarges the local currency supply. And then everybody has more euros. So it is what we are richer. So it's essentially we've had more money coming in via the export. So from that perspective, we know from the history of many countries, countries that have been growing fast, they have been doing that via export-led economies. There is really no other way around it. So if we want to be a rich country, and if we want to grow at something like fast growth rates, at least 7% per year. The only way how to do that is if we are building up export-led companies. The question is which companies to support. And maybe the first question is, do we need to support some sector, like specific sector that say, okay, we go for this sector and then we support nothing else? I think maybe not. In Latvia, I think one of the beauties of Latvian economy is that we have companies in many export segments, and that really makes us diversified, and that is good. Also, another beauty is that we are very close to Scandinavia, and we can very easily link to Scandinavian, Northern European supply chains, and we don't necessarily have to produce something from here, from local ingredients. So again, from that sense of point of view, it can be whatever. But I think a very good kind of way how to distinguish companies that need to be supported versus the ones that don't need to be supported is the value added. How much value added a company produces from one employee. And there are big differences in Latvian economy. So some of the companies that produce the lowest value added in Latvian economy sadly are the ones in the restaurant and food and catering business. They have very low value added overall. Tourism, by the way, is also with very low added value in Latvia. So what we are selling, the hotel beds, is very low value, and the people are receiving also very low value. And some of the companies that are producing very large, very high value added per employee are companies in pharmaceutical area, in electronics, in software development. So I think it's a kind of a good way to look, is to look at, where the companies with larger value added are, and then go for the companies and try to develop those companies that are able to produce higher value added per employee. So that I think would be kind of a good way how to look and think. And so it's a company that can export, that has a very large possible market, and that has a very high value added per employee. So those would be kind of my criteria if I were to choose, with which company to go, what to support in this export-led economy.
The one reservation that I have is if I look at the large exporting countries currently in the world, and that would be Germany and China, they're also hugely unequal countries, and that's in many ways a deliberate policy choice, right? Is repressing wages, is repressing local consumption, make sure that that the trade surplus or the current account surplus remains in surplus, and that basically creates a certain kind of class interest, which becomes very powerful. And then the question is, how do we make sure that, say we do design Latvia as an export country and it's a success, how do we make sure that the gains are actually fairly and evenly distributed throughout society? Because, knowing Latvia, say we do have increased tax revenue receipts, how do we make sure that these aren't used to pay down the national debt, which is, has been growing now during the last year? Or how do we make sure that there isn't a specific sort of exporter class arising, which is very powerful in lobbying for certain kind of tax cuts for themselves at the expense of others, and then these kinds of issues. Jeff or Gus, to be honest, perhaps I'm not sure if anybody who would like to react to these kind of concerns that these kinds of this kind of policy might engender.
Yeah, I think we should feel that at the end. Kaspars, do you have anything more to say about development and export policy? Because I know this is something you've thought a lot about. I think you should tender your comments first.
Continuing some of the thoughts that Jānis has developed, looking back on some of the policies that Latvia has developed, a few years back there was something that was called the smart specialization strategy or something like that. And basically it correctly, in my view, emphasized that, there should be kind of three-pronged approach. One, you need to not forget also about the traditional industries, because sometimes there is an obsession about the very hip startups and how they will be creating these unicorns, and this will be the new supercharged Latvian economy of the 21st century. It usually doesn't work unless you have an industrial and innovation base, which leads to systematic development of such unicorns, which means that they're not unicorns anymore because they are part of a systematic process. So there was a focus on kind of strengthening the manufacturing and export capacity of the traditional industries. Because of course, some of the giants of the Latvian economy, including the woodworking industry, which still exports annually goods worth of 2 billion, most of which, at least half of which, is sawn timber, which is again a bit tragic 30 years after the regaining of the independence. Then, of course, you also have the food processing industry with a relatively limited added value, and also you see kind of elements of locking in, a bit of colonial relationships with us, as the Latvian economy exporting production inputs and then paying for final goods from some of our neighboring countries, which is a bad industrial policy. So traditional industries was one area. The other area, which is something that Jānis also emphasized, is finding those growth activities, not necessarily on a sectoral basis, because a whole sector is like the average body temperature in a hospital. I mean, it's so diverse, and as Jānis notes, I fully agree. We have a pretty diversified set of small and medium-sized companies, but maybe not a whole one coherent industry where everything needs to be supported. So finding those and developing the added value potential, that was kind of seen as the second important prong. And then the third one was kind of industries with an important horizontal impact on the economy and also on the transformation of the economy. But interestingly, even though on the high level, they kind of correctly categorized the Latvian economy, the recommendations of that strategy was to kind of focus on particular niche industries, such as, I think it was bioeconomics, there was biomedicine and pharmaceuticals, there was of course IT, there was smart energy, some smaller elements taken out from the wider economic structure. And if you add them together, they wouldn't carry too much macroeconomic weight. So yes, all of those industries are worthwhile promoting, also by public means, but they're not the ones that will kind of serve as the main wind in the sail of the entire economy. And then complementing that smart specialization strategy was the industrial policy, or kind of guidelines for industrial policy development. I think it was 2014, 2020. So it just is ending this year, and none of the KPIs are achieved, including 15% manufacturing incidents in the economy. That's definitely not achieved. But also because it was a very hands-off industrial policy, because it was based on theories of industrial policy that is there to alleviate market failure. These were not activist kind of mission-oriented tools that Jānis is talking about, with a very direct, for example, mission to promote the export competency sector, export complexity, with a growing added value, and promoting all of these other side impacts. So if we think about an export-driven development, we need to maybe again return to an inventory of the Latvian economy. What are the strengths? Again, a balance between the existing traditional competitive advantages, but also fields of future growth. I mean, the IT industry is a great example from the services export perspective. I mean, back in the day, it used to be, of course, transport and finance. Transport is still 40% of Latvian services export, and of course, finance is diminishing rapidly. But the superstar, the growing superstar, is the IT industry, for example. So clearly, one industry, not everyone in that industry, but especially those that have export capacity and growing added value and complexity, those, of course, need to be supported. So I think, an understanding of what are those potential long-term advantages, and such that do not lock us in, as some have. For example, sawn timber exports or transit of coal and oil products coming from the east, or the eastern financial offshore. These are not sustainable elephants on which to hold a long-term Latvian economic development. So I'm in sync definitely with Jānis on the need to find these kind of scalable, competent, complex, and long-term growth potential niches and companies and industries.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Actually, I'm not going to add much at all. I mean, you're very fortunate tonight that you have two of Latvia's very top experts on this particular topic, and it's always a pleasure and a delight to hear what they have to say, because the advice that they tender is just very, very smart, and I hope it'll be installed as national policy. But of course, the one thing that Kaspars could talk about for the entire hour himself, if given the opportunity, and I think he should be given that opportunity in the future, is to talk about the role of infrastructure in promoting industrial development as well. So, after you target your chief sectors for development, what would be the infrastructure needs that would facilitate or foster their development? So that's something that we don't have time to address now, but Kaspars is certainly your guy to go to for that. And of course, I'm sure Janis would have many useful comments to contribute on that as well. Regarding, though, something you said, Andris, which of course is the problem of emerging inequality in the global system. I guess something that Thomas Piketty and others have alluded to. These are vexing problems. Of course, much of it just comes with the supply side revolution of the past 40 years, which has suggested that if we just put more capital in private hands, that is automatically going to lead to development. And so we cut taxes and we push down wages to that end, in the hopes that the capital that is liberated becomes investment capital, which in turn is put into research and development, which in turn leads to innovation, which in turn leads to higher levels of productivity. Well, of course, we've seen over the past 40 years that has not happened. And referencing, people such as Mariana Mazzucato, who, of course, Kaspars and Janis are quite familiar with her work, as she has shown much of the essential R&D that is needed in order for companies to commercialize it, develop it, get it out to the market. The basic research can really only be funded by the public sector. So there needs to be more complementarity there. But in terms of that inequality issue, I mean, we just have to dispense with a lot of the supply side nonsense that somehow if you just make wealthy people even richer, that it's going to automatically lead to development. Now, they can use their capital effectively, but you have to incentivize it with the proper tax policies, and just to make sure that it doesn't get dumped into real estate or valuable tracts of land in the city center, which sit idle for 30 years and then maybe get sold at a windfall profit, after a few decades. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you absolutely want to avoid.
I feel that, for instance, the question on inequality would be, and the question of like low wages as a way how to drive these companies up is, it's a question. I look at it this way. Look, first of all, you need the export economy, and an export economy that's with certain amount of inequality, but that brings in capital to the country, is better than no export at all. Because if you don't have any export but very equal society, then it's equally poor. There's no point in that. So better to have unequal but export-oriented than nothing. But the export-oriented with very low wages is also a kind of a dead end, or something that you can do for a few years and then it's over. Because sooner or later, they move these exporting companies that exploit low wages. They just move down somewhere into a different country. So you need to have a way how you are developing exporting industry that pays high wages. So how do you do that? The answer is the value added per employee. So if the value added per employee in a company is high, it can easily afford to pay high wages and still be competitive. How do you get that it is able to have a high value added per employee? Well, it has to be in the right business and the right sector. Secondly, it has to have some intellectual property, because that isn't kind of an easy way how to do that. And it has to have large enough scale of manufacturing. When it has a large enough scale of manufacturing and it has intellectual property, then you can do that. Now, how to get there? I think you need to support export-led companies, and also you need to support R&D and investment into R&D. Because if you are developing and supporting R&D, then you are allowing the companies to produce goods that can be sold at a higher price, or with the higher margins. Whenever you have higher margins, then you can easily afford to pay higher wages, and then you are not stuck into a competitive necessity to have a low wage economy. And I think that actually, and the other thing, the third thing that is very necessary there is credit that's available for investment. If you have great idea, but you don't have money for it, I mean, that idea remains an idea. So if we want to develop an export-led economy that pays high wages and is sustainable, we need government expenditure on R&D. There's no way around it, and heavy subsidies for the companies towards the R&D. Right now, they're not there in Latvia. And second is you need enough capital for the companies to develop. So the development bank, more money for the Altum, other kind of options that are there and that can develop us, and a clear kind of push towards sectors where there is higher added value. And if we are, for instance, developing software companies, these have zero problem to pay 2,000, 3,000 euro salaries and tax and still be profitable because simply their goods can be sold at that price. If we want to develop, let's say, companies in textile industry where there would be people, with the sewing machines producing jeans, there is zero way that these can have a high wages. They are competing then with the Chinese and the Vietnamese, etc. So there's zero way that you can pay them anything normal. So if you want to develop that kind of a companies, then you need to really depress wages, make a very huge inequality in society. That's the only way how you can drive an export economy like that. That's something that we don't want. So I think that also a very clear understanding that if we want to drive wages up, then we need more resources for R&D. If we need more resources for R&D, we need, sadly, to have a little bit more tax that we can put back into a form of R&D is also something that we really need to think about here overall as a country. And so I think that there are countries like China that show that you can grow pretty quickly, and also their incomes, their wages also are growing in China, and the country overall is developing. And why? And many people have been saying, for instance, in regards to credit, that in China there's a credit bubble, the bubble will burst, it will be over. I've heard this like many times over the years, but you can see that the Chinese bubble never ends, and it continues. And I think mathematically, kind of a very elegant way how to say why the Chinese bubble continues forever is because their cost of funding is lower than the rate of growth. So as long as China is able to grow at something like 7% per year, but the cost of funding is below 7% per year, so let's say 2-3%, then the bubble is like forever sustainable, because there will be more profits generated out of this bubble than the cost of the banking fees and interest paid, so you can continue forever. If we are on the other side in an economy where companies pay, let's say, 8% for the loans, but grow at a speed of maybe 2-3% per year or 4% per year, then obviously, mathematically, you end up with a higher debt burden that stops you sooner or later. So that is, again, kind of a thing why we need to think about government-funded or government-subsidized funding opportunities for companies, because we need to provide the credit at reasonable rates simply to be able to sustain this kind of forever bubble, if you want to call it that way, like what the China has done. And that creates lots more of opportunities for growth and prosperity for everybody. Plus R&D, we must invest more in R&D and development of the products.
Now, this kind of what you mentioned, research and development, and kind of moving perhaps closer to the issue of social policy. The long-term solutions for inequality are kind of broadly accepted. There are investments in healthcare, investments in education. Is there and lately I'm thinking, is there a kind of way in which, because we're talking about a lot of investment needed in many different areas, and it's clear that there has to be some kind of reckoning of what the kind of how to do that properly to make sure that all the investment is carried out financially feasibly. Is there a way in which the kind of necessary investments in healthcare and education can be sort of tied together with these investments in developing the kind of export segment of the economy, in the sense that a growing export economy would automatically mean growing investments in healthcare and education. Is there a kind of way in which we can square these different kind of investment projects to make sure that all of them develop organically in reaction to each?
I would maybe do first. I think one of the kind of a really neoliberal approaches to development has been saying very cleverly that you need to invest more in education, and if people will be more educated, more smarter, then the economy will grow. But sadly, it hasn't worked out for Latvia. So we have invested a lot in education. We have a very high number of people with higher education, but they are all emigrated to Ireland and UK. So essentially what we've done is we've created a very highly educated workforce that we've paid. I mean, I'm a parent. I know exactly how much it costs to raise a child, like purely monetary. It's huge. Every parent knows that. And then if a child like that's only my money, but then imagine the government's money additionally in schools, everything else. If you put it together, it's a huge amount. And if a child like that at the age of 25 leaves and works somewhere in Germany or UK, it's that all that investment is lost essentially for the country. It's not coming back. So I think that kind of one way how not to develop a country is simply to orient yourself to develop highly skilled people. Then they are leaving. So jobs is very, very important. So if you don't have good jobs that pay good, so that people that are finishing universities here have good jobs here that are paying good wages, so that they are able to stay and grow here in Latvia. It also doesn't square anything, So from that perspective, everything comes together. So you can't have great healthcare system, you can't have great education system if you don't have great jobs. And the only way how to create great jobs is to grow your export sector. So you have to do all three things simultaneously. And just making education great is making Germany great and Ireland great, not Latvia.
And this maybe also leads to a bit of a paradox. I mean, Latvia is a middle income country with relatively low purchasing power and low wages. At the same time, when you think in terms of kind of competitiveness and cost of production, it's a high cost economy because the financial costs are relatively high, because of an underdeveloped financial industry. Therefore, high margins. I think Jeff alluded to that in detail. The labor costs are high, even though take home pay is low, but the overall labor costs are high because 70% goes on top of the net pay, and per unit, Latvia probably has one of the world's largest labor tax rates. Healthcare is also relatively expensive. Supposedly it's free, but still there is a huge percentage of out of pocket. So for employees and for the wider public, these costs are high. Innovation costs are high because there's no systemic way of subsidizing the innovation process. In conjunction with some of the universities and research facilities, like Sweden does. There's a triangle between public, academia and the corporate sector to co-develop infrastructure. Then also, you have somewhat of a poor infrastructure, which also leads to higher production cost. And ultimately, since Latvia is, 50% of Latvian economy is Riga, and Riga is arguably the only agglomeration in Latvia that has kind of economies of scale of being, an economy of regional or international significance. And because of that, and because of poor tax policies, the real estate costs are high. So that's an additional cost for developing business in Latvia and developing a base for export competitiveness out of Latvia. And this is a bit of a paradox because on one hand we are a middle income country. We supposedly should be competitive in terms of our cost structure, but unfortunately we are not, because all of the other costs in the economy are relatively high, or higher than would be normal for our level of development.
I think that Kaspar's made a really, really important point. And when looking at, for instance, and I've been asking banks as part of the government's effort to develop a strategy, I've been asking banks, so why is the total lending dropping in Latvia? Why still today, lending levels go down every year? Since 2010, every year, lower lending levels. So you get less and less money in the economy. So how can you grow with lower lending levels? It's impossible. And you ask the banks why, but they say we have nobody to finance. What do you mean? Nobody to finance? Yeah, but the companies, they don't have enough profitability. Their EBITDA levels are too low. And why is that? We are supposedly, we should be, more competitive than the Sweden with lower wages. So the company should be making lots of profit, but it's not the case, because other costs are too high. And if you look, for instance, in my company, we specialized in building floors for industrial buildings. I can sadly tell you, in Sweden, we are building incomparably more. So right now we are, for instance, participating in a huge 300,000 square meter project building a battery plant for electric vehicles in Sweden. Why in Sweden? Why are they building it in Sweden? Why not in Latvia? Because the electricity cost, for instance, is too high in Latvia. It's so high that it doesn't, you can't build electricity-intensive manufacturing like producing batteries for electric vehicles. So you want to develop green economy and everything, but because of the tax on electricity, the OIK, our costs are out of hand, and other costs like the tax on the wages, etc., is out of hand, and so we are not getting this manufacturing unit here. And what is the result? The result is that probably some Latvians are going to be ending up working there in that plant, like so many people are working in Sweden. And what is good in there for Latvia? Nothing. So I think that we really need to think seriously as a company, how do we lower cost while at the same time increasing the wages for people? And what are the ways how we can really think? I think it's clear that the existing way, the way how we have been working past 30 years is not really sustainable, doesn't work out. There's nothing come out of it, and we need to change a few things. And I think some of the things that we alluded to here in this discussion are totally things that are necessary to do, because otherwise it's a dead end.
Yeah, I think we've come full circle here in a very good way, in that this is really the crux of the matter. Latvia does have a high cost economy, and all of the things that we have discussed previously, whether it be a land value tax in order to replace, to switch out with the high labor taxes, and also in order to reduce the cost of housing, and many of these other costs that we've talked about, whether it be for access to your capital, etc. All of these things make Latvia a high cost country. A country that has many sources of passive income is going to be a high cost country. And so that is a cost which comes in the form ultimately of lower wages, lower levels of development, and it's just more expensive for people to live. So if one is wondering, well, what's in it for me in terms of all these changes that we've proposed, it's just that. Ultimately, what we're talking about is reducing costs in Latvia, making a more efficient, productive, innovative economy that is less burdened with these myriad of costs that can allow people to live better, healthier, with more income, and with more capital available for investment in the social sphere and other spheres as well.
This is rounding up very, very, very beautifully. But I think before we sort of, by way of conclusion, sort of the issue of jobs was already mentioned, and the last idea that I wanted to sort of bounce up with you was the idea of a job guarantee program, which has become a kind of almost a personal favorite of mine to think about, which is sort of juxtaposed to the idea of universal basic income, with the difference being that in a job guarantee program, the income would be conditional on your willingness to work, and it's basically an idea that says that whoever wants to work would be guaranteed employment in the public sector, whether that be the government sector or the municipality sector. And that was an idea which received this kind of extra energy, or these additional impulses this year due to the pandemic, when we saw the unemployment levels, especially in the US, skyrocket. And the idea was, and in Latvia, pretty much not in the sense of the unemployment, but at least the idea that the social policy is not very effective, that it's not that we don't really know what are the effects of our current social policy. There's a lot of black holes, a lot of unthought through kind of mechanics there. Sort of the basic idea would be that we would have to start thinking about redesigning the entire social policy, and the idea of employment being central there is what sort of the job guarantee program stands for. I am wondering, given the current context, unemployment in Latvia didn't really go up as high as say in the Baltics, even though the work hours is something that did drop in comparison to our neighbors. What do you think of the idea? Is a job guarantee program something that is viable currently in Latvia, or again, due to the kind of political economic constraints in which we are, this is something that has to be reworked, has to be worked out on a supranational level as opposed to national?
Well, I guess, hopefully you don't want to have to make recourse to this. Now, Andris, I'm not telling you or Janis or Kaspars anything you don't already know, but this is, Pierre Hyman Minsky, right? So you want to make sure that you have all hands working, and it's just very simple. If people are working, they're producing value. And so it's, rather than having a universal basic income in which, people might be idle but consuming, and so that is providing some economic demand. Minsky always argued, I think with some legitimacy, that full employment is really what you want. And so Martin Luther King, by the way, in the United States also argued the same thing, that having the government as an employer of last resort, which means that they would have to be employed at a lower wage than what the private market is offering, is best for everyone. There's lots of social needs, whether it's cleaning up parks, improving neighborhoods, etc. The only downside of it is that it does come with a cost. So one could think of it as reducing costs in the long term, because you're keeping people ready for the job market in terms of their habits, getting up at a certain time, going somewhere every day reliably, and just being ready to insert into the private job market as well, should circumstances ever permit their entry. But it does cost more than just giving people money. So one has to calculate whether or not one can do it in a way which creates more value than it costs. I think it's a good idea as well, but it is just a matter of trying to figure out what jobs people can do, and to ensure that those jobs ultimately produce more value than they cost.
In my opinion, the job guarantee makes sense if you pay people reasonable wages. So we had a job guarantee program that was called the 100 Lats program. That was ridiculous because, what do you mean? I mean, it's like you get 100 Lats for pretending that you work somewhere in the park, cleaning something. It's not bad. It's not a real thing that you want. You want like good wages. That's what you want. But the problem, in my opinion, with good wages is the question, where do you take the money from? And if you are a currency issuing country, like what Latvia used to be when we had lots, or where United States is, or Australia is, or Switzerland is, then you can simply issue the currency with which you employ the people, and then the people work, and it doesn't kind of cost anything to run an economy like that. But if you don't issue your own currency, then you have to borrow it. And Latvia essentially runs on a foreign currency, because euro is a kind of a foreign currency for us. It's the easiest way how to think about it. And so we have to borrow that money. And then the question is how do you pay it back? And who pays it back? And how much can you borrow to sustain programs like that? So I think that this means, because of the constraints where we are as a country, the only way how we can really think about the supplying job guarantee is if we develop the exporting sector. Because in exporting sector, if we are developing jobs, then these jobs, they pay for themselves. So for me, kind of a job guarantee would automatically be rather thinking, how do you create productive jobs that are in the export sector? Because that is sustainable, that brings in the money into Latvia. And that answers to the kind of a socio-economic kind of a capital system where Latvia is located, because we are not located sadly anymore in a country that issues its own currency. And how to do that? I think it's not difficult. For instance, I'm really proposing a super easy way how to employ large amount of people with high wages is to subsidize on-the-job training for IT companies. So IT companies, they can, most people with higher education or most people with secondary degree, they can be trained into programming works. Programming doesn't necessarily, computers, software development works doesn't necessarily mean knowing kind of very advanced languages. There's lots of testing, there's lots of user interface work and others. But even the languages, they're not so difficult to do. So you can actually put a lot of people and train. You don't need to have an IT degree to become a successful software engineer or work for a software company, but you can have an on-the-job training, let's say in a year and a half. Most companies are able, just in internal training programs, turn out people that are able to work successfully in software development. But the private companies, they have a huge cost to do that. I mean, for 1.5 years, they would have to pay for a person like that. And I think that if the government, for instance, paid full wage for people that go into software development and would tell to guys like Accenture, the others, that there is a government program that they can have, 90% or 70% of the total cost of the wage taken care of by the government subsidy, and then with the caveat that they'll be able to develop out of these people software engineers, we would have on the one side real jobs, develop people's skills, and develop a sector with very high added value. And that the cost of doing that would be kind of low, because what is like 1.5 years wages to develop somebody that then for 20 years brings back the tax to the country? It's like there's a no-brainer that it's very, very good business for the economy. And so I think these kinds of schemes that they need to be run, and then we can really develop something that would approach guaranteed employment. And I think that we need right now in this COVID time, we need far more active government policy on measures like this. It's so easy to do. I think government is wasting huge opportunity right now by not doing that. And we can really turn the economy around and develop these productive sectors and develop real people with real wages. And in software industry right now, like I said, there's no problem to receive 2,000-3,000 euro salaries, good salaries, good money paid, and the cost to subsidize maybe 20,000-30,000 euro, which is like nothing per person. And then you create software engineer out of it. Like a government simply needs to do that, and that would really answer these questions. And there are more opportunities like that.
Just to continue Yannis' thought, it is quite clear that this kind of on-the-job training extremely extensively used in the Nordics. I remember also in the end of 2000s during the crisis, there was a lot of, instead of firing people, government simply subsidized those workplaces as on-the-job training schemes, but essentially those were guaranteed jobs because the government knew that ultimately these people are anyways coming on unemployment insurance. Then better to retrain these people on the job in the private sector, and this is a wonderful option, and in my view a subset of a job guarantee scheme. But also very importantly, maybe in the wider context, a job guarantee does not necessarily have to be a net cost to the society, especially in the kind of medium long term, because of course all of the social ills that the unemployment creates bears a cost on the society. Anything ranging from an outright emigration, which Latvia has of course seen in scores and hundreds of thousands, to different social ills, to crime, to excess cost in the healthcare industry. So at the end of the day, it's still a cost on the society. And I agree here with Minsky and post-Keynesians that full employment should be the ultimate goal, ultimate macroeconomic goal, because of course all of the benefit that employment creates and all of the ills that unemployment creates. And in Latvia, of course, we don't have a uniform situation when it comes to unemployment. I mean, there's very little unemployment usually in and around Riga, but at the same time, Latgale is always in high double digits. With very high rates of these negative externalities of unemployment. So Latgale could definitely be a platform, certainly not the mockery, Jānis, that you mentioned about the 100 Lats program, which really put a bad name to the whole idea of a job guarantee, but maybe Latgale, which is further behind the rest of the Latvian economy in terms of competitiveness employment rates. Maybe there is a possibility, but also combining perhaps that with maybe creating these jobs with the existing private companies on the job training schemes, in addition to what Jeff alluded to, public works, in terms of caring for the environment, caring for the community, for the people. A lot of the work that's already happening already today in a hidden fashion. That's one of the reasons why I dislike the term taxpayers, because it's an exclusive term which excludes people which are maybe not receiving taxed salaries, but at the same time they're doing valuable jobs for the economy. I mean, grandmothers looking after their grandchildren, or parents parenting children, or any other, or maybe unemployed people helping around the home in an agricultural farm or something like that. And in some of the kind of non-Riga environments, these are very real jobs which are underappreciated by the society, because unfortunately in the kind of generation brought up by shock therapy, unemployment is often stigmatized. I mean, it's a very individualistic interpretation of the causes of unemployment, that people are lazy, that people don't have the willingness, that people are untalented, that people will never change. And I think that's completely contrary to a more progressive idea that employment for those who are able and willing to work is the main goal. And then clearly we have the possibility, even now during the COVID times. I absolutely agree with Jānis that we are wasting time. Even simpler things, not going so far as to have on-the-job training. That's super important, but difficult for Latvia at this stage. But at least vouchers for online training, so that people could use this time to maybe acquire some new skills, including with EU funding being injected. But at the end of the day, I would love to see Latvia, being on a more progressive path of viewing full employment as the macroeconomic goal, unlike false goals like budget deficits or government debt rates, or even inflation if taken as a standalone measure.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that in Latvia, there's a lot of debate right now that we need to have. There's this fiscal discipline, and there's this fiscal discipline council, and the very nice gentlemen and ladies working there. But I think their take is wrong. In that they are only looking at a kind of a balance of the budget, but they are not looking if the money is invested or if it is simply spent. So that angle is missing from their reports and their thinking, and that is fundamentally totally wrong. The way they should be looking is that not only looking at the economy as a kind of a set amount, they should be looking at what are the ways with which we can use the money so that the total size of the economy grows. And what is our kind of a debt situation then if the economy grows? Obviously, if the economy is bigger, then the debt becomes relatively smaller and easier to sustainable. So the first thing that the Fiscal Discipline Council needs to be looking at actually is how do you grow the economy faster. They're not looking at that, and that is fundamentally super wrong.
Right.
It's like looking only at one side of the equation and not looking at the other side of the equation. It's wrong. And how they should be looking really is very different. So they should be looking at how do you grow the total size of the economy, and what's the relative amount of the debt that you have, and what can we do to grow the economy faster. And they should be looking at what is Latvia's net debt position, private plus public together, because that is the important task. And how do you reduce that? Obviously, you reduce that by exporting more than importing, because then you bring in the money and reduce your net debt position. And obviously, you are doing that by growing your size of your economy, and then your debt also becomes becomes smaller. So this is a reform that I would like to see for Fiscal Discipline Council, where they should do things differently.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Giannis. And just as you said, very nice people on the Fiscal Discipline Council. But given the Constitution, in other words, who's on that body, given their age, experience, etc., they're just not going to look at these issues properly. And without naming names, some of them actually got the 2008 financial crash just entirely wrong. They thought it was a government spending crisis. Rather than a private debt crisis, which was looming. And they're just not focused on issues which actually facilitate or foster economic growth. I mean, ultimately, the questions that they're interested in are ones which ensure macroeconomic stability and the purpose of ensuring that returns to investors or savers are stable. And that's not the same thing as development and fostering strong economic growth. So you need another group that's actually advising on these issues.
Or another goals for these guys, because right now the goal for them is how do you balance the budget, or how does our budget deficit is not bigger than what is kind of sustainable budget.
Yeah. But there, it's
look at one
at the risk of being unkind, it's a Dr. Strangelove kind of situation. They're always going to return to looking at it in the way that they look at it.
Yeah, I understand, but anyway, I don't know. I still have. I'm not so against that. I think these are clever people.
Yeah, sure, good people. Yeah,
the look is wrong, because they only look at one side of the equation, which is crazy. Because you have two sides of the equation. Come on.
Right. Sure.
Well, even if kind of the council purports to be one that promotes a counter-cyclical approach to fiscal policy, even if it comes with a bit of a neoliberal bias. But I have never heard from the Fiscal Discipline Council any calls for additional fiscal stimulus, which you do in a downfall if you're really and fairly promoting a counter-cyclical approach. It's a separate discussion whether a country in a steep development phase should or should not be running permanent fiscal deficits. So that's a different discussion. But if we are in counter-cyclical approach, that there needs to be a cycle where you're actually promoting fiscal stimulus to the economy, especially during downturn. And I haven't heard that, unfortunately, from the council. We have heard some positive signs from the new Bank of Latvia governor in some of his recent announcements, especially also with focus on unemployment, competitiveness, and stimulus to the economy, but not the Fiscal Discipline Council.
Okay, guys, this has been as always to me very intellectually enriching, and I really have to thank you for the contributions and reflections. I think we covered quite a lot, and I really hope that listeners will either have learned something new or at least developed some of the ideas that they heard in more depth. I want to remind everyone that today the panel consisted of Professor Jeffrey Sommers, who teaches political economy and public policy at the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We had Kaspars Bruškens, who is a development economist, as well as and Jānis Ošļevs, who is also an economist and CEO of Primex. The discussion took place thanks to Freedom and Solidarity Foundation and Edward Foundation. So we thank them for giving us the opportunity to speak on these issues. And I'm sure that within the near future, we'll carry on these discussions in one way or another, either within the same set of participants that we currently have, or perhaps an expanded list of people. So again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Andris, for beautiful hosting and the moderation.
Thank you very much, guys.
Take care all.